Welcome, friends, to another tale of our famed, battle-worn yet foolhardy adventurers and their deeds of honour, compassion, but also the less-heard deeds of dishonour and greed. So this was an adventure that is still ongoing, of which I've named the Sorrow of Rook-Wing. Rook-Wing is a small village many miles from the city of Stoneshore, which is the capital city of the Kingdom of Uthros, one of 4 kingdoms in the continent of Oscaria. As always, I was the Dungeon Master, and my group consisted of Matthew, Ted, Cameron and Tom, who I guess you could say is the normal group for our sessions, although we have others that drop in and out at times, like Sydney or Joe. So in this instance, Matthew was playing a female Dragonborn fighter called Korin, who had really gone to town on the armour and had an AC of 19 at level 3, which was pretty good. He could have gotten more AC, but he decided to become an Eldritch Knight instead because he wanted to be able to cast spells. Obviously, forgetting the fact that he'd given himself a really poor intelligence score, so his spells were practically useless anyway. Cameron was playing a male human cleric called Pavel, and the interesting about his character was that where the other characters were quite young, so Matthew, for example, was 20 years old, Tom was 34, and Ted was 25, Cameron was 65 years of age, but yet he was somehow exceedingly good with his dex rolls despite having poor dexterity. It was funny to imagine a decrepit old man ducking and diving through a rain of arrows. Tom was playing a male Tiefling Warlock called Temerity. Tom had based his whole character centred around one cantrip called Eldritch Blast, which was okay in theory because it had mildly good damage and it had some good buffs added to it from his skills, but this devotion to one cantrip and nothing else would eventually screw him over late in the adventure, as we'll find out. And finally, Ted was playing a female human ranger called Frost, and his character was quite interesting actually. He had good dex and wisdom, all leading to for his archery and his tracking skills, and he was quite good at getting stuck in with his sword to help Matthew out too. All in all, I'd say Ted's character was probably the best at what it was meant to do of the 4 characters. So the adventure itself starts off pretty standard. They're outside the Shackled Mistress Tavern in the village of Rook-Wing, and they spend the night there, where they overhear that there's been trouble afoot. After inquiring, they are told to seek out the Jarl of the village in the morning. That's exactly what they do, and end up getting told that war bands of gnolls, goblins and other monsters kidnapped the Jarl's daughter Thura, and they've conducted raids on the village, and that furthermore his son Thurk foolishly went after her alone. So the adventurers set off, but it's a distance to travel, so they walk all day and have to camp out overnight. And in the night, they get attacked by 2 ankegs, which are like large burrowing lizard-like creatures. The fight was a lot tougher than it should have been, and they sustained quite heavy damage in this first encounter, but they still survived. Cameron was able to patch up their wounds and so on. The next day they approached the hill where the dungeon is. A large wall stands between 2 large rocks that guards the entrance to the dungeon, and hiding behind a boulder is Thurk, injured with an arrow in his leg, and goblins atop the walls firing more arrows. Knowing my players well, I knew exactly what each of them would do, and it's exactly what they did do. Matthew raised his shield and charged towards the open gate. Ted provided covering fire by returning a hail of arrows towards the goblin archers. Tom tried to fire off a few spells here and there, and Cameron cowered behind the rock and tended to Thurk's wounds. Matthew was relatively unscathed, but Ted and Tom took a few arrow hits. When Matthew got behind the wall, he was met by 3 more goblins, a goblin chieftain, and their pet ankeg, which scared him a little due to the previous night. Ted and Tom continued to fire arrows back at the goblin archers while Cameron decided to run forwards to help out Matthew, and Ted eventually did the same, drawing his sword, while Tom continued to fire spells at the archers. They soon dispatched the goblins. I strictly remember the chieftain banging on the dungeon door begging for it to be opened when Cameron cast his divine wrath and smited him against the wall, but the party had sustained many wounds, so Cameron had to do some bandaging and use some of his valuable cure wound spells. Thurk then agreed to return to the village and let them find his sister. They then entered a dungeon by blasting down the door, and the first room they entered was inhabited by 4 gnolls and a mysterious man in a hood and cowl with a sabre and dark magic. They killed the gnolls, and the mysterious man evaporated into smoke and fled down the passageway. Following this passageway, they came to an optional door down the corridor with a face in it. The face spoke as if it was a normal person, not knowing that it was a door. On the door, it said that the password was stone. The party soon figured out that they had to make the door say the password, but they had a lot of difficulty actually trying to get it to say stone. Eventually they did, however, and the door opened, and they were allowed to choose one of the party members to get a treasure, and they chose Cameron, who ultimately got the Winter's Light, a mace which could use the damage dealt to regain hit points to a creature within range. The next room was divided in two, with a 15-foot drop into a small pool of water and a 1-foot wide plank across it. On the other side were 2 wights and 2 skeletons, which were firing arrows at the party. Matthew, trying to be the obvious hero, charges across only to get hit by a harpoon by a Merrow hiding in the water and dragged him into it. He lost his shield and had to fight with just his sword against a Merrow by himself while the rest of the party dealt with the wights and skeletons. After doing that, Cameron jumps down to help Matthew, and Ted dexterously jumps onto the Merrow's back and holds on while slicing its neck. Tom tried to stay up top, but completely failed the dex roll and actually fell down into the pool anyway. And then he failed a fear check so badly that he actually pissed himself. And the Merrow was infuriated by this. The Merrow was eventually bested, and they used a grappling hook to climb out. They then found a cell with Thura in, and she said that the Gnoll Fang was here, and they needed to stop him lest the world fall to the creatures he would spawn from a Hellgate. So, while Thura leaves the dungeon and heads home, the party trudges forward, eventually coming to the final room, a large cave with a very high roof. Inside was a Drider, some bugbears, the mysterious man from earlier, and the Gnoll Fang, who created a force field around himself so that the adventurers couldn't get to him. So after a long fight with the beasties, they eventually were victorious, and before they killed the mysterious man, the Fang and him actually had an argument, and eventually the mysterious man decided to help the adventurers. But in the midst of all of this, a Hellgate was opened, and a helmed horror walks through. The mysterious man, whose name turns out to be Vagaroth, gets pinned against a wall cast by a spell cast by the Fang, so he's out of action for the boss fight. The helmed horror and Matthew engage in battle, swinging and exchanging blows, blocking with great shields as their swords clanged together and rung and scraped against their armour. Matthew then threw an acid potion over the helmed horror, destroying its great shield. This is where Tom found out that helmed horrors were invulnerable to force damage, so his Eldritch Blast was completely useless. So he practically had to sit the fight out, just get stuck in with his fists. Cam got stuck in with his mace, keeping Matthew alive with his heals, and Ted came in with his sword to help too, and eventually they bested it but sustained heavy injuries. The Fang teleported away, but left behind a chalice, which the party assumed to be important, and so took it. The mysterious man thanked them and promised to aid them in the future before leaving. This is where our brave party, blood-stained and battle-worn, injured and tired, emerged from the dungeon victorious, proud of their heroic deed. The adventure finished with them heading back to Rook-Wing to claim their reward from the Jarl. But what mysteries lie in wait? Find out next time in The Sorrow of Rook-Wing. Thank you for joining me in my telling of this magnificent tale, adventurer. I hope you can return soon to hear another.